I've always loved Japanese animation and comics and robots and monsters. When I met my wife, Hiroko, she would always say, why don't you go back to the roots? And to me, this was like a revelation. I was like, roots? What roots?
At the Smithsonian's Freer-Sackler Galleries, Matt Alt and his wife Hiroko Yoda have been furthering their research on the origins of Japanese pop culture. Based in Tokyo, Matt and Hiroko are experts on the art, stories, and characters that inspire today's anime and manga.
In modern terms, anime is simply a shorthand for animation, an animated film or a TV show. Japanese call that anime. Manga, on the other hand, is the word for illustrated entertainment, basically a comic book, or what we would more call a graphic novel. Manga only started being imported to America in the 1980s. It's actually quite an old word. Manga was coined by none other than Hokusai in the 1800s to define his sketchbooks. And it literally means silly drawings, pointless drawings, meaningless drawings, doodles. This one is actually called Hokusai manga. You can see this kind of playfulness and this kind of irreverence.
Mass production in the late 19th century made these images available to a much wider audience.
The ability of Japanese illustrators to get right to the core of what makes people laugh, of what makes people scared, what makes people cry, what gets them aroused, I think points to this sophistication.
Early artwork of bizarre, supernatural creatures inspired painter Kawanabe Kyosai to create the Demon's Night Parade, published in woodblock printed form in the 1880s.
I remember when I looked at this book for the first time, it was like the scales had fallen from my eyes. The vibrant color and the line work, but the action, the dynamism of the images, and this deeply human sense of humor drawn by people who had no connection to my culture or my history or my background. And yet I was laughing right along with them and being creeped out right along with them. I've never actually touched these books before. This is quite exciting. Oh, wow. Is this Kyosai's mark here? This is really cute. It's like a hieroglyphic almost. Oh, wow. Look, it's the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They're here. This is before they became ninja. Wow, what a great drawing. What really struck me as an American was how many of these monsters aren't really monsters, but they're actually physical objects, everyday objects. Like in this case, we have a lute and a floor harp, a koto. In another one, we have shoes and sandals, brushes, all sorts of these strange creatures that are formed from things that live in the world around us.
Japanese folklore and early religiosity describe a world where even inanimate things have spirits. That tradition of creatively animating the unexpected continues today.
This idea that the world around us can be full of spirits, monsters, both forces for good and evil, was a very interesting sort of way of looking at the world. Just bubbling just under the surface are all sorts of these strange and wild creatures that nobody really likes to talk about, or didn't like to talk about until now when they became a part of modern pop culture.
From the time of its opening in 1978, the skyscraper Sunshine 60 was said to be haunted by spirits erupting from its dark foundations.
When Hiroko and I were researching our book Yurei Attack, one of the more interesting episodes we uncovered centered not on an old house, but a skyscraper right in the middle of Tokyo called Sunshine 60. Built on ground where some very nasty stuff happened. The Japanese war criminals were tried and hung there. There was a prison there. There were all sorts of historical events, such as murders and killings that happened there. But the reason that we covered it in the book was that we kept finding all of these references to what are called foxfire, kitsunebi, these mysterious fireballs that were sighted around the top of the building, swirling around at night right after it was built. Now, these fireballs are similar to what we would call will-o'-the-wisp in Western folklore, but they are a constant presence in Japanese folklore and myth. And what they are just mysterious blue or red balls of fire. And there have been many attempts to kind of portray this sort of thing over the ages, the most famous being a print from Hiroshige with the exact same title, Foxfire. They're ethereal sorts of presences. They don't really exist. It's another example that no matter how much the powers that be try to cover up or to prettify the past, the people will always find a way to dig down and kind of remember it. There's a collective memory in Japan that won't let the powers that be forget. That even in this modern metropolis, in the corners of this modern metropolis, lurk strange creatures and strange happenings.
In the late 1800s, Japan's rulers were keen to modernize the country and attempted to denigrate and suppress old beliefs as unenlightened and uncivilized.
They wanted them to focus on steam engines and modernizing the military and things like that. But as these beautifully illustrated and sophisticated books show, there was a huge hunger for this sort of thing among the populace at large. And I think it just goes to show you really can't keep a good monster down.
In a similar vein to today's political cartoons, Japanese artists often used manga as a vehicle for social and political satire.
One of the fascinating things I realized when Hiroko and I started looking at all of these Edo and Meiji era books was how many of these were actually social satire, political cartoons. It might be very difficult to directly criticize the emperor or the shogun or the powers that be, but if you make your antagonist a monster or a demon or a ghost, it becomes a lot easier to say these things you wouldn't be able to say otherwise. The Japanese government actually did succeed to a certain extent in suppressing folklore and superstition. And then at the turn of the 20th century, a Greek-born journalist by the name of Lafcadio Hearn traveled to Japan and with his Japanese wife uncovered a lot of this folklore again by going around and actually interviewing Japanese people on the street and putting them down in writing for the first time anywhere.
Hearn's English language adaptations made this rich tradition known worldwide. Foreign fascination helped to legitimize interest in these weird corners of the Japanese past. This renewed interest may have paved the way for the vast number of comic book narratives published today.